Everybody. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our most prestigious event during the academic year here at USC. My name is Wolf Gruner. I'm a professor of history. I hold the Shapiro Chair in Jewish Studies, and I'm the founding director of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, which hosts the 2019-2020 Sara and Asa Shapiro Scholar Lecture. I will hand over to Stephen Smith, the executive director of the USC Shoah Foundation, who holds the Andrew and Erna Finchi-Viterbi Endowed Executive Director Chair and the UNESCO Chair in Genocide Studies. He will talk a little bit about the kind of endowment of this lecture, and then it goes back to me, and I introduce our speaker, Peter Hayes.
Thank you, Wolf. I also want to thank both Badema and Martha, who put the event together this evening, for today, and also throughout the year run events and programs both here at the University of Southern California and around the country. Thank you, both of you, Martha and Badema, for your extremely good hard work in behalf of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research. It's a real delight to welcome Peter Hayes here to be our Sara and Asa Shapiro lecturer today, and also to welcome Voltaire, his husband, who's with us. Thank you both for being here, for making the journey from Chicago to the sunny climes of Southern California in March. It's a delight to have you here with us today, not only because of your scholarship, Peter, but because of the way in which you've influenced many of us that are in this room today over many, many years. In a world, a very small world in which we live, where people bump into each other all of the time, it's a small miracle that Peter Hayes and I have never met each other until today, or yesterday.
Or last night.
It's actually must be a freak of nature, because we must have been at exactly the same conferences many, many times, but never have. And it was a delight to have a chance to finally meet you, Peter, and welcome you here. Today we're here because of a true friend of the USC Shoah Foundation, Mickey Shapiro, whose parents, Asa and Sara, both Holocaust survivors. In 2012 I had the immense privilege to interview Sara Shapiro for the USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive. Both of them born in Koretz in the Ukraine. And in the Koretz ghetto. Sara survived by using her considerable wit and strategy as a 12-year-old to outsmart both the Nazis and the Ukrainians, and spent 3 years as a quote-unquote maid in a Ukrainian home under a pseudonym that she'd picked up along the way. For those of you who have not heard her story, you can find that on the Visual History Archive, Sara with no H, Shapiro, and it's available online for you to view. Later this year, there will be a feature film called My Name is Sara, which will be available in theatres in June. So keep an eye out for that here in Los Angeles. A beautiful film about Sara Shapiro, the child that managed to survive in extraordinary circumstances. I want to thank Mickey Shapiro for his undying support for the USC Shoah Foundation. You might notice his name in the other side of the building, where he has named not only this lecture but also part of this building, and continues to be a support to us not only financially but in many, many different ways as one of our members of our executive committee on our board of councillors, and is a tireless worker on behalf of education and remembrance. We're missing him today. He's not able to be with us because of other commitments, but Mickey, we're sending you very best wishes, and thank you for all that you do for us. It's my distinct pleasure, therefore, to hand the podium back to Wolf, who's going to introduce our speaker today. Wolf Gruner, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's not easy to introduce Peter Hayes because he is a very kind of international renowned scholar of the Holocaust, and he does a lot of things which also relates to the Shoah Foundation. If I would probably fill the whole time of the lecture with all his kind of merits and accomplishments. I try to keep this short. So Peter Hayes got his PhD in Yale. He is a professor emeritus now of history and German, and he is the Theodore Weiss Holocaust Educational Foundation professor emeritus of Holocaust Studies at Northwestern University. He is a very accomplished scholar. He was a recipient of numerous very prestigious fellowships, like the Guggenheim. He was a Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence at the Holocaust Museum. He got a Distinguished Achievement Award in Holocaust Studies, and the National Leadership Award from the Holocaust Museum. He is the author of more than 13 books and numerous articles and book chapters. He is an economic historian, so his prize-winning books on the industry and ideology, IG Farben in the Nazi era, and also he co-edited Lessons and Legacies, The Meaning of the Holocaust in a Changing World. He always had several functions. He was not just kind of a scholar writing, he was always also giving more to the discipline of Holocaust studies, so he was member of boards of multiple professional societies and Holocaust memorial sites, including most recently he was functioning as the chair of the academic committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum from 2014 till 2019. He is very known as a praise teacher at Northwestern. He got awards for this, as also an esteemed graduate advisor. And I will mention this because he is instrumental in bringing Holocaust studies to, or was instrumental and is still, to bringing Holocaust studies to universities in the United States. And this is what you normally can't kind of get from his website or from website at Northwestern. He was instrumental in, at the end of the 1980s, creating kind of a venue for Holocaust scholars around kind of at universities in the US and bringing Holocaust studies to the classrooms at universities, because he worked closely with the Holocaust Educational Foundation, and they founded a biannual conference, which in the beginning was kind of a national convention for Holocaust scholars, pretty small. It's now the biggest international biannual conference for Holocaust studies, and he was instrumental in founding this, managing this, kind of developing this, and I think countless scholars in the US, but I would not restrict this to the US, are actually thankful for his kind of tremendous service in this regard. And I'm one of them, because without him I would not stand here for various reasons. One is actually connected to this Holocaust Educational Foundation, the Lessons and Legacies Conference, because he kind of creating this venue, at some point it was open to international scholars and especially graduate students. And I was one of these kind of graduate students and postdocs who came from Germany to the US and encountered kind of an exchange of ideas, which was tremendously impactful on my own career. And then there's another kind of personal reasons. We actually know each other since we just established this since 1992. We met in an archive, so we are both kind of archival hardcore researchers, and that's created a lifelong kind of connection. And he was, as he did with others, not just me, was really kind of in a way a mentoring capacity for me. So I really, I'm extremely thankful for this. Beyond my personal connection, he was the only American member of the Independent Historians Commission on the History of the German Foreign Office in the Third Reich in the Federal Republic. This report of this commission was published as in German as Das Amt und die Vergangenheit, the Office and the Past, and became a big bestseller in Germany. Since then, he published very influential works, as, for example, he co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Studies, which was published in 2010, and then also as a paperback. And more recently, He kind of published introductions to the Holocaust as, for example, a Holocaust Reader, How Was It Possible, in 2015. And then his most recent one, which I think is kind of the synthesis of all his kind of lecturing at Northwestern. It's called Why? Explaining the Holocaust, and published in English in 2017, and since then in Chinese, German, and Spanish, and the Polish translation is just kind of in the making. He is currently completing, and this is a full circle for him as an economic historian, a book about the big German businesses and the Holocaust. And this is kind of the lifelong trajectory of his work, studying these businesses and their role in facilitating, enabling, and sometimes even radicalizing the persecution of the Jews. And coming to our talk today, his actually most recent publication is a co-edited volume where he and Christopher Browning kind of dug up forgotten pieces which were very important, authored by the very well-known historian Raoul Hilberg. And this book is about German railroads and Jewish souls, and kind of digs into what the German railroad actually, what kind of role this played during the Holocaust. And there he contributes with an article or a chapter kind of thinking about the idea or kind of the thesis that there's a lot of logistics which went into the extermination of the Jews, and some of the notions we have are went a lot of efforts into this. A lot of trains were used, but he makes the case that if you look closer and with kind of an economic lens, it actually changes the perspective, and I think this is the theme for today. It doesn't need a lot of effort to kill a lot of people. Please welcome Peter Hayes.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. You already know why, if I say thank you for the invitation, that you know I'm sincere. I came from Chicago at this time of year. As a way of rewarding you for that, I'm going to do something this morning that I never do. I taught undergraduates for 35 years. I took great pride in the fact that I worked without a net. That is, if I couldn't hold their attention without any bells and whistles on the screen, that I wasn't doing my job. But today, I'm getting older. Come on. This is hard work. So I am going to use some bells and whistles today. I believe I can hit the arrow and the space bar, which is as sophisticated as I need to do for this, but we'll see, okay? This is an experiment. Metaphors are seductive things. The more apt they seem, the more likely we are to forget that the light they throw also casts shadows. At least so it seems to me regarding the frequent references in Holocaust discourse to industrialized murder at factories of death. The ubiquity of these terms attests to the power of a handful of familiar images. Of the gate at Birkenau, the ramp at Birkenau, and the brick gas chambers at Birkenau. I think this is crematorium 5. This is the last of the ones that was built at Birkenau, one of the 2 that was above ground, and the first 2 were, the gas chambers were below ground. Now, the ubiquity of these terms attests to the power of a handful of these images to shape our conception of the process by which the Nazi state killed Jews. But in efficient, orderly, and disassembly line fashion is precisely how most Jews did not die in the Holocaust, even at most death camps. And those familiar images of Birkenau and selections there do not record the extent of the horror visited upon even most victims of that site. The problem is not just that a majority of the people gassed at Birkenau never passed through the gate you just saw and unloaded on that infamous ramp, since it was not ready until May of 1944 and the arrival of the Hungarian Jews. Until then, the doomed walked from another ramp near the Auschwitz railroad station across an open field for about 1.5 miles until they reached the gas chambers. Moreover, until the spring of 1943, those gas chambers were not the large brick structures with high chimneys for the attached ovens, like the one I just flashed on the screen. Instead, 2 small, pre-existing, only slightly modified peasant farmhouses served as the gassing installations. They lacked ventilation systems to permit use in steady succession, and no crematoria existed at all. Bodies were dumped in pits at first and later burned in the open air. Birkenau's initially rudimentary state is not the only circumstance that gives the lie to the idea of sophisticated and smoothly functioning murder. There is also the fact that the photos of the selections of Hungarian Jews in 1944 that have come down to us in the form of the famous Auschwitz album are highly misleading. Those images record not 1, but at least 4 different arrivals of deportation trains. The shots were staged in order to create an album that would be shown to Nazi bigwigs later, to display how effectively the SS was processing the victims and their effects. And the pictures were perforce taken during daylight, whereas most trains from Hungary were scheduled to arrive at night, when the combination of darkness and searchlights disoriented the passengers and made them easier to manipulate. As any reader of the most famous and chilling memoirs of arrival at Birkenau knows, these pictures present an extremely sanitized view of what happened. In short, our most common verbal and pictorial images of murder by gas are profoundly unrepresentative. They document a very late state in the annihilation of the European Jews, by which time it had acquired an infrastructure and corresponding procedures that barely resembled the bloody mayhem of the preceding years. By the time those 4 combined killing and disposal buildings opened at Birkenau during 1943 and transformed it into the epicenter of the Holocaust, 3/4 of the final solution's victims already had perished, including about 2/3 of those who ever died by gas. Less than 5% of these murders had occurred at Auschwitz-Birkenau by the spring of 1943. Instead, at the peak of the Holocaust, Jews had been slaughtered in countless villages and forests across the occupied East. In the forts surrounding Kovno, in the pits the Soviets had dug to store fuel in the Ponary forest near Vilnius, and in the ravines of Babi Yar near Kiev. This is a post-war picture. This is not what was happening at the time. And in 4 jury-rigged installations whose mission was to liquidate the Jews of pre-war Poland with carbon monoxide gas and then to disappear from history. In order of their foundation, they were called Szemno, or in German Kulmhof, Bjuszec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Along with Auschwitz, which antedated them, and Birkenau, which took shape as they did, these killing centers described a rough circle around the Polish heartland. There was little industrial or high-tech, and next to nothing carefully planned and cleanly carried out about the nearly 2 million murders that these carbon monoxide camps accounted for by the time the first brick crematorium at Auschwitz at Birkenau became operational. Let alone about the other 2 million deaths tallied in the same time period by the Einsatzgruppen, the other German shooting units, and their indigenous helpers. In the words of Ulrich Herbert, one of the leading German scholars of the subject, the Holocaust at its peak consisted of, quote, apocalyptic, altogether primitive massacres marked by an almost incomprehensible cruelty, unquote. A major reason why this description applies to the gassing sites as well as the shooting ones is that, as both Lawrence Rees and David Cesarani aptly have noted, the gassing sites were makeshift installations. Their builders had almost no money and had to cobble the sites together from whatever material the first commanders could scavenge or seize from the vicinities. Partly as a result, those builders generally underestimated the space and equipment required to kill the numbers of people destined for each site, to process their possessions, and to dispose of their bodies. In consequence, these sites often did not run smoothly or even deceive their victims. Instead, they were characterized by frequent outbursts of chaos and brutality. In other words, the depiction of camp operations that the SS sought to present in the Auschwitz album, that image of the people lined up on the ramps, was the opposite of the conditions that prevailed at the carbon monoxide camps at the apex of the final solution, and thus of the circumstances in which most Jews went to the gas. Both the locations and layouts of the carbon monoxide camps reflected the scant resources allocated to their commanders. They gravitated to sites that already had something to build on or around. Notably, a derelict manor house for processing prisoners and a volunteer fire department's building for housing personnel at Chelmno. Or railway offices as quarters for the SS and anti-tank ditches dating from 1939-40 that could serve as burial pits at Birschetz. Or a forester's house and barn and a post office and a chapel that became the administrative offices at Sobibor. And a rail spur that ran from the village of Treblinka into the forest toward a gravel pit where the SS earlier had exploited Jewish labor. To be sure, all four of these installations were inexpensive to put up. Their designers developed ingenuity in using mere wooden sawhorses, barbed wire, and tree boughs to hide both camp operations from the outside world and the gassing facilities from the victims as they arrived. At Treblinka, the hiding was accomplished merely by piling up a high wall of earth between the railroad tracks and the gas chambers, so the latter became invisible. But the shortage of construction material led to improvised and inadequate designs that in turn produced anything but an orderly and automated process of murder and plunder. Let us take a closer look at each of these sites. Chelmno, in the part of pre-war Poland annexed by Germany, was nothing more than a rundown manor house confiscated from the Polish state. To make it a suitable installation for funneling Jews into vans with rear compartments hooked up to the vehicle's exhaust pipes, the SS, starting in October 1941, merely had to scrape together enough wood to surround the building on three sides, construct a gate, and board up the basement windows, and enough wire to string along a riverbank on the fourth side of the estate property. The victims were trucked in usually after having been held and deprived of food for days, then lodged overnight in a synagogue of one nearby town or a mill in another. In groups of 35 to 40 people, they assembled inside the gate in the open air, heard a deceptive speech about their future, descended a stairway into the building's basement, surrendered what was left of their possessions as they passed through it, and walked up a wooden ramp on the other side, at first nearly and later fully naked, into a van. After Jewish prisoners closed and barred the doors, the vehicles either idled or drove until the people inside died of the exhaust fumes. Killing capacity never became an issue here, as the SS could simply increase the number of trucks and trips per day, but disposing of the effects and the bodies of the murdered people soon raised problems. So much clothing went into the storage rooms in the mansion that garments spilled out the windows onto the grounds, where despite efforts to cover the booty with tarps, much of it became useless, until the commanders decided to start storing it in a nearby church. Similarly, the 3 9-meter deep mass graves dug in a nearby forest stank and heaved to the point that transports had to be suspended for a month in mid-1942, while burning pits were created. But these too emitted a stench that extended for some 15 kilometers and compromised the secrecy of the operation, such as it was. So they were soon replaced by 2 brick crematoria with tall chimneys. They lasted only about 6 months until they were blown up, along with parts of the manor house, leaving its foundations. We have very few pictures of what this manor house looked like before the war. This is a poor one, but it does show you the stairway that gave people access to the house. This is what's left of it. Now I want to draw your attention to this because look at the size of what you're looking at. This is the stairway through which people came in. They went down here, they came through this central passageway. The point that they ascended to the vans was over here. You see the footprint of that house. It is, what, maybe 30 yards on the long side and maybe 15? Between 150 and 225,000 people were killed here. That's the infrastructure to do it. After they blew it up and left only its foundations, they put some wooden fencing around the former mass graves, planted thousands of seedlings to cover up, and those were the only remains. Bierschetz was larger than the tiny manor house grounds at Chelmno, but still very small, roughly 300 meters by 250. Now this is an image from the air of the monument that was created in 2004. That is the full size of the camp. It's, as I'll say in a minute, it's located on the side of a hill. The railroad train that came in is along here. The unloading place was roughly here. I'll show some more details in a minute. But you get a sense, this is a place where roughly 600,000 people were killed. What they basically did here, again, was string some fencing, put up a few prefab barracks, and that was it. Bierschetz was larger than Chelmno, but still very small, roughly 300 meters by 250, so 300 yards by 250 about, and nowhere near adequate to its intended purpose, which was to murder the hundreds of thousands of Jews who lived between Krakow and Lviv. Krakow now in the middle of southern Poland, but in those days in the west, and Lviv is now in the northwest of Ukraine. The camp was built on a slope next to a rail spur that ran parallel to the main line at the edge of a little village where the SS commandeered housing for its own use. And all of the site's roughly 10 original modest structures were made of wood. These included several prefab barracks that local forced laborers hammered together in the waning days of 1941. One of them contained 3 gas chambers, whose interior walls consisted of 2 parallel sets of boards with a layer of sand in between, some metal flashing along the lower interior walls, and the roofs and the outer walls covered with tar paper. I don't mean to be flippant, but you can buy this at Home Depot. So this is what they were putting into this. Now, those barracks, incidentally, were down along here originally, at this edge of the camp. The trains came in here, people unloaded here. The first gas chambers were at this edge and were visible to everybody getting off the train. Okay. Deportation trains were pushed into the camp along the spur, 15 to 20 freight cars at a time, and those aboard were told to disembark, disrobe, and enter the chambers, which at first were so close to the rail spur and visible that the guards had to beat the victims into them. When all the chambers functioned, they could kill 600 people. And in the first 2 months of operation, from March to May of 1942, despite frequent problems with the captured Soviet tank engines that produced the carbon monoxide, the average killing rate reached about 2,500 people per day. To the surprise of the designers, this was too many for the burial pits, one of which actually erupted in May of 1942 and sent decomposing bodies rolling downhill toward the rail spur. Now, on this particular drawing, you see the black spots that are darker stone? Those are the sites of the burial pits that archaeologists have established. And remember, this is a slope. So we don't know exactly which one of the pits. It's recorded in the records of the people who were there. We don't know which one burst. But this is the downhill when they were coming down. Successive closings of the camp in May of 42 and again in June and July were required to repair these defects. The wooden gassing barrack disappeared, and a solid, probably brick building with 6 chambers was placed farther up the slope, out of sight and reachable only by a narrow passageway of trellises laced with barbed wire and fir tree branches, which was called the tube. Now, this is a lateral version of what you just saw as an aerial shot. And one of the geniuses of this monument, which was finished in 2004, is this slice into the edge roughly corresponds to where the tube ran. And the spot that it ends up here, this is a memorial wall that has the names of families who were deported, insofar as we can establish this, who were deported to this site. The gas chamber was about here, where these axes come together. And so it was further up the slope, and you can still see the slope, particularly on this, and how this was laid out. Again, small size. Within that small size, you can conceal operations and so forth, but they had to learn this. They did not understand it from the beginning, and they had to constantly modify the site. The new gas chambers roughly tripled the site's killing capacity. Buchetz went over to disposing of bodies by burning on metal grates, as well as to exhuming and burning those already in the pits. But already by December 1942, only 9 months after the camp opened, the room in the pits was running out even for the ashes. So deportations ceased and dismantling began. By mid-1943, the site had been planted with trees, a farmer's house, and a German resident, all to belie that a killing center ever had existed. Sobibor was modeled on Buchetz, though much larger in physical dimensions and much smaller in the number of deaths it caused, largely because the rail line that gave access to the site ran through a swamp and was sometimes impassable. The camp opened in May of 1942 and eventually acquired an air of permanence. Once existing houses in the vicinity had been cannibalized for building materials, which is also how the first buildings at Birkenau were put up, at about the same time. Now this I think I can be reasonably sure that you have all never seen this picture before. I can't be reasonably sure about anything I've showed you before, but this picture first came to light 6 weeks ago. This picture is part of a souvenir album that a man named Johann Niemann made. Johann Niemann was the vice commandant of Sobibor. He was killed. He was the first person killed in the uprising at Sobibor. That was the trigger for the uprising. He's the guy who was having a fur coat made, and he went into the workshop where that was being done, and the resistance stabbed him. He had sent home to his family pictures of his posting. And this has been in the attic of the Niemann family in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany for all these years. How many years is it now? Since 1945? And they finally, about 2 years ago, brought the album to the attention of a local history group, which turned it over to an organization in Berlin called the Topographie des Terrors, which is the headquarters of the SS, and they published this in January of this year. Now, what you are seeing here, this is really remarkable. This is not when Sobibor began. This is in 1943, and it was a going operation for a while. You are standing at, I want to be sure I get this right, you're looking east along the southern perimeter of the camp. The white roof that you see here is the railroad station where people unloaded. And they were walked in front of those buildings, which only at the very start of 1943 got a coat of plaster. That's why they're white. They were originally built out of the bricks and the wood of the houses that were in the village that were torn down to make things for the SS. And so once they acquired a coat of plaster, they looked like a pleasant little village, which deceived many deportees at first blush, but only momentarily. For they had to strip naked upon arrival in a covered but sand-strewn space. Now, the caption of this picture in the book says you can see that covering. I can't. I've tried to figure it out. The route that people followed was they walked along here, beyond these buildings, the entrance to the area where the gas chambers are all outside the picture. He was not allowed, and he observed the restriction that he would not photograph the north side of the camp. That's the killing part. But you do see these are camp inmates. These are Ukrainian guards that are taking the perimeter. You see the way in which they used the wire and the fir boughs to make the walls so that you couldn't see inside. That was also true internally within the camp, dividing all the subsectors so that even when you were in the middle of it, you didn't quite know where you were going, but you were being whipped in a certain direction. So they were told to strip naked upon arrival. They stood in a covered but sand-strewn square, and then they were driven, usually with considerable violence, that included the deployment of an attack dog, into a tube and toward the gas chambers, which are up there on the, out of your sight. As at Buchet's, many of the people arriving were too sick or weak to get down from the trains. So they, like at Buchet's, were carted to the end of the train ramp, ironically to the site of the pre-existing chapel, and mowed down with bullets into pits. And that's at the extreme left of that line following from that white roof. Once more, the initial gas chambers, this time built of brick on a concrete slab, proved too small for the SS's purposes. So they had to be replaced in September 1942 with ones twice the size. Here too, despite the camp's large extent and relatively low inflow of victims, the practice of burying them gave way to burning the bodies. In fact, the practice began here at Sobibor. The defects of the SS's planning for the killing centers were nowhere more apparent than at the last of them to become operational. Yet the one that may have killed almost as many Jews as Birkenau ever did, and at a much faster rate. The death toll of deportees to Treblinka was somewhere between 800,000 and 925,000 people, most of whom perished in the first 6 months of the site's operations, between late July 1942 and late January 1943. Now, I want these numbers to take time for this to sink in. 800,000 people, most of whom, at minimum, most of whom were killed within 6 months. This is an overhead view today of the site of Treblinka. And there's one more. And this is a map. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's look at this. People came in on a train line that was here. People unloaded roughly in this space. The monument up there is located roughly where the gas chambers were. There was a large berm of earth that ran here, so you could not, from here, see anything up there. It was a wall of earth that cut off your vision. People disrobed here. They were drawn through a tube that ran through the trees. They had their hair shorn and so forth. They came out the other end and they walked into the gas chambers. Now this is a bigger site, obviously, than Buchet's, where you saw on the side of the hill and so on. But even so, when you stand there, you realize that the great bulk of the space that you see, and this is marked by the stones up here and over here, those were not space being used to deliver people and kill people. That space was used for the burning of bodies. The actual space in which people arrived, were processed, if you will, and were killed, and then were delivered to the places where the bodies would be burned, is small. And this is in the middle of nowhere. It's a forest which had no other use for anybody at all. Indeed, during the frenetic first 5 weeks of killing at Treblinka, the average number of Treblinka's victims came to 56,000 per week, which means over 9,000 per day since gassings were suspended on Sundays. This meant almost around-the-clock operations because the first gas chambers could hold only 600 people. It also meant excruciating suffering for the deportees, as the rail line inside the camp could accommodate at most 20 train wagons at a time, as at Buchet's and Sobibor, but the transports to Treblinka often were longer, consisting of up to 60 wagons. Trains backed up, not only outside the camp and in the village of Treblinka, but at way stations all along the line between Warsaw or Białystok and the camp, with the result that large numbers of people died of heat and thirst in the freight cars. Inside the camp, the need to reduce the interval between arrivals left less time for clearing away bodies and people's effects. So the guards abandoned all pretense of camouflage and beat and shot arriving Jews in order to hasten their passage into the tube. Both the storehouses and the burial pits overflowed. In short, Treblinka recapitulated the history of inadequate planning leading to mounting violence and procedural resets that had unfolded at Buchet's and Sobibor. And the solution adopted was also the same: a short suspension of deportations, a swift construction of new and expanded gas chambers, and a switch from burying bodies to burning them. But notice, no crematoria at any of these camps. Burning them in the open air, at most. Well, the crematory was at Chelmno, but not at the others. The new gas chambers, at Treblinka, which had a theoretical capacity of 4,000 people, even though the camp railroad spur could not receive more than 2,000 people at a time. The new gas chambers soon made Treblinka, in the words of David Cesarani, quote, the most lethal place on earth, unquote. Yet even the construction of the new gas chambers attested to the makeshift character of the Holocaust at its peak. For how and where did the camp commandant get the bricks to build the gas chambers with? By blowing up a tall chimney in a Polish town 20 kilometers away and recycling them. So what do these short histories of the carbon monoxide plants tell us? And I just want to give you one. I didn't show you this. This gives you a sense of, you had the view from this side in the aerial view. This is the way the camp was set up. And so people got out here, they went through here, the roll call, the tube is up here, this is that, and then all of this is body disposal area or camouflage from the other. That's the way the camp was designed. And again, you have a relatively small space. I always say to people, when you go to these sites, and you go to Birkenau, you're overwhelmed at Birkenau by the size of it. The scale is enormous. And you go to Treblinka, and you're overwhelmed by the smallness of it. And they both killed roughly an equal number of people by gas. So what do these short histories of the carbon monoxide plants tell us? 3 important things, I think. First, they focus our attention on the 11 months from March 1942 to the end of January 1943, when 1/2 of the total Jewish victims of the Holocaust died. 2/3 of them at or on the way to these places. And on the fierce apogee of the killing between late July and early November 1942, an interval of only 3 months, during which almost 1/4 of all the Jewish victims of the Holocaust perished, of whom, once again, 2/3 died at or on the way to these sites. And now I'm going to show you something that captures this. This is not original to me. This is the work of an Israeli mathematician named Levi Stone, who did something. He's an amateur historian of the Holocaust, and I'm supposed to be a pro. And he did something that never occurred to any of us to do, which is to actually map deportations in the fall of 1940, latter part of 1942, when we know the killing was at its height, to map them to the 4 camps I've talked about, 3 of them, Buchetz, Sobibor, and Treblinka, from south to north, were part of a thing called Operation Reinhard, which is the killing of the Jews of non-annexed Poland. Chelmno was to kill the Jews of the part of Poland that had been annexed to Germany. Okay, so these 4 camps are concentrating on the Jewish population in pre-war Poland. So what he did is he mapped deportations, what record we have of from what village were people picked up on what day and sent to which camp. And you're going to see a map on the left side of the screen I'm going to show you, which is that. So you have the 3 camps. You'll have Buchetz, Sobibor, Treblinka, south to north, and you will have different colored dots. I think it's blue for Buchetz, and it's green for Sobibor, and it's red for Treblinka. And then on the right-hand side, you're going to see a graph. These things are going to move simultaneously, so I'll play it twice if we need to do it. And that's going to show you the rise in the death toll during 1942. So this is all credit to Levi Stone, who did this. And he allowed me to use this today. Okay. Now, if I hit the bar, now this is slowed down a little bit from the way I got it, so I think it will be easier for you to follow than initially. But you're going to be looking at 2 things at once. These are, the colors seem a little flattened out. These are the deportations. These are spots on rail lines, and these are the 3 camps. And as those spots multiply, which tell you where shipments are going and where they are going to, you will see over here a graph that shows you the rise in the cumulative death tolls from these 3 camps only. And then if you add, bear in mind that as this is happening, the shooting units in the occupied Soviet Union are killing another 300,000 or 400,000 people. So you can add this to how many people died in this incredibly compressed period of time. Basically the last half of 1942 with a little overlap. So those are the train shipments, and you're getting blue, so that's supposed to go to Buchetz. And see the red line is rising on the right. So Buchetz predominates in the deportations early. Then Sobibor had backed up, and now you start to see the red dots appear up further in the north. Those are going to Treblinka. So there was a kind of area specialization of each camp. And look at the slope of the line. And then you get to the end of the year and the line begins to flatten. So the intensity by time and space of the killing is captured by this. And this is all before those crematoria at Birkenau even start. Okay? Everybody follow it? All right. These deaths were not the output of a well-planned and well-oiled mechanism, but of haphazardly conceived and constructed sites that were built and operated on the cheap and subject to repeated breakdowns. At the risk once more of sounding flippant, to call the places I've described factories of death is almost to dignify them, and to insult factories and the people who design and operate them. Outwardly, at least until Treblinka constructed its mock railroad station around the square where people got out, these sites looked more like lumber yards and sawmills than factories. Indeed, they functioned more like stockyards and slaughterhouses. Second, calling these places industrial death factories reduces their victims to inputs, dehumanizes them, and distracts us from the sheer viciousness and gore that characterized most of the final solution. In the future, this metaphor will be all the more a problem, because references to factories will be more likely to call to young people's minds an image of an apple plant in China, mind-numbingly monotonous but clean, than an image of a filthy and dangerous machine shop. Third, precisely because the death factory image fits Birkenau best, it reinforces the tendency to exaggerate the space occupied by that site and nearby Auschwitz in American and much of European memory of the Holocaust. I once published an essay whose title called Auschwitz-Birkenau, quote, the capital of the Holocaust, unquote. Because that's what it is in most people's minds. But it was not that in reality. It was the culmination and product of an extraordinarily barbaric and bloody learning process through which the Nazi regime discovered how to kill large numbers of people at lowest cost and exploit others at highest profit. But about 85% of the Jews killed in the Holocaust died somewhere else, and in much less quasi-industrial fashion. Or to put the matter in astounding reverse, tens of thousands of inmates survived the camp complex around Auschwitz. But in 1945, no more than 150 people ever sent to the 4 other camps I have discussed were still alive. Would not Holocaust memory be better served by abandoning the tired metaphor that I have targeted and refocusing attention on what really matters? The unspeakable degradation and brutality that Nazi Germany visited on a group of human beings, and the inexpensive and low-tech fashion in which it could do so. I think so, but I'm probably tilting at windmills. Many historians have spent careers utterly and convincingly refuting persistent and popular impressions of the past without making much of a dent in them. Besides, metaphors are seductive, as I said at the outset. A comparison to sawmills or slaughterhouses does not pack the same rhetorical punch. But I hope I have convinced you that a seemingly apt metaphor can, as in this case, light up an aspect of the past while obscuring other, equally important and disturbing dimensions of it. Thank you for your attention. We're going to do questions? We're going to do questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Peter Hayes. So I will open the floor for questions, comments. Do you want to moderate this yourself?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, I give the floor to you and to Pete.
Martha.
Thank you so much for this revealing talk. It's really stunning and powerful. So thank you. I'm curious what we know about the manpower required.
Yeah, this is
Also
very small. There were no more than 500 Germans who ever served at all four of these camps. The garrison at any one time was usually about 20 Germans. In 1943, Treblinka had around 30. Most of the manpower was 90 to 120 Heavies. Heavies were people recruited out of Soviet prisoner of war camps where they were starving and basically told, we'll give you a uniform and 3 squares a day if you will help us with this. And Heavies became very important in the suppression of the Warsaw Rising, in rounding up many of the ghetto populations, and in providing the guard force for these camps. The people you saw on the perimeter of that shot of Sobibor were almost surely Ukrainians who had been brought out of that. So 90 to 100 auxiliaries who were not being diverted from the German front lines, and maybe 20 to 30 Germans at any one time on these sites. This is a microcosm of this the stunning misrelation of inputs to outputs, if you will. The resources the Germans apply to killing vast numbers of people are tiny. And you can do this with, you know, because I'm kind of a numbers guy and I end up doing macabre things. I once figured out how much the Zyklon used at Birkenau cost to kill a person. And if you relate the quantities that were ordered to what the SS said they applied and so forth, it works out to just less than 1 US cent per corpse in 1943. US money in 1943. It works out to 2 German pennies, Pfennig, and the exchange rate in those days was 2.5 German Pfennig to 1 US cent. And that's what it cost to buy the Zyklon. So in every way, this whole operation is something that they are, a way to put it, and the same is true with the trains. The number of trains used, the number of cars used, the way they reuse them, and so the Germans did this with their little fingers. Yes?
I also want to echo what Martha said, to thank you so much for this really eye-opening and difficult but important talk. And comment and quick question. The comment is that moving beyond the metaphor of the factory and industrialized killing, I think has all kinds of implications for comparative genocide, right? Because often there's a sort of false opposition held up between the modernity of the Germans,
Right.
the modernity of Holocaust. Right. So I think it's really helpful to get beyond that. The question is probably kind of obvious from the talk, which is I'm trying to understand why so few resources were allocated to this final solution, given its centrality in kind of the Nazi program, right?
Yes, and this is a hard thing for us to figure out because the centrality is built into Hitlerian ideology. It is clear that Heinrich Himmler is the voice in Hitler's ear always saying, now is the time, let's move. But the idea is Hitler's. And yet, when they do this, there is a central office in Berlin, which is also where Eichmann sits and makes these plans, except Eichmann is not in charge of these trains. He's in charge of the trains that come from everywhere outside of non-annexed Poland, the so-called general government. The man who was the Eichmann of the general government is a man named Hans Höfler, who he coordinated all the trains within the general government. But anything coming from France or from Germany or from outside was Eichmann. So Eichmann sits in a building on the Kurfürstenstraße in Berlin, a building that had been the headquarters of the Jewish Brethren Society. So what do? They take over a pre-existing site, which they've confiscated. It costs them nothing, and that's the network. I think it is just, I guess part of the answer is they discover they can do it on the cheap. And they don't have to do more, so they just do it this way. There is some element of let's not let the word spread too widely because it can get picked up and used for propaganda against us and so on. But they're not awfully worried about that. There's a little bit, but not awfully. I think the real feeling is they just set out, let's see what we can do. There is one bureaucratic explanation to your question. Heinrich Himmler, the budget of the Reich was determined by the finance minister. Heinrich Himmler did not, at the beginning of this process, have independent access to special pools of funds. He does over time, because after they start plundering the Jewish communities, they recycle the money. And so the trains are paid for by the Jews who are being shipped, particularly if they come from Western Europe or if they come from Germany. Even in the ghettos of Poland, what they do is they shake down the local Jewish leaders in advance of the deportations and basically say, we want a ransom of X. And then they get the money, and that's what they use to pay for the rolling stock and so forth. But the payments to the National Railway are not that great. But at the beginning, he has no access to independent money. And he can't go to the Reichsfinance minister, a man named Schwerin von Krosigk, and basically look at him and say, the Fuhrer has told me I'm going to exterminate the Jews of Europe, and I need you to pony up the funds. That's too much information. So that, I think, is the initial impediment, and that's what encourages them to do it, to see what they can do on the fly. But then once they realize that they can do this, subject to the course corrections that I told you about, I mean, they start underestimating what they need, and then they add to it. But by then, they have access to more money. And the other thing, the scavenging, this is all done by Höss, the commandant at Auschwitz, used to tell people initially this is with the main camp, before even Birkenau, that he had to send squads out into basically pillaging in the vicinity to get pots and pans for the kitchen. Even that kind of thing. But they discover they can do it, and remember, this is occupied Poland. An SS battalion shows up at your door and says, we're taking all the things out of your kitchen, and you don't say no. So there's nothing in their way for doing it that way. So I think these are partial explanations that add up. Yes?
Why was it so easy for them to do so? To get the local population to go along with it and give them the pots and pans to do all of that?
Well, number one, they're carrying the guns. But number two, this is occupied Poland. And the Polish people, as well as the Jews, are basically, in the eyes of the Germans, vogelfrei. Outlaws. You can do anything to them. No one is going to arrest you for shooting a Polish civilian. And so they show up and they take things. This is occupied Poland. The general government was a lawless place in which the Germans could basically do what they wanted to do, and they did. Now, why is there cooperation in subsequent ways? I mean, you're dealing with a history of anti-Semitism in the region, in part. You're also dealing with fear. You know, one of the most tragic parts of this story is who's still alive when this is over? In the spring of 1943, who is still alive in places like this? Either individuals who are in hiding, or in a few ghettos where people have been kept alive to do work for the German state and army. That's it. The people in hiding are often given up or hunted down. Why? Well, one reason is because the Germans say, if we find a Jew in your village, there will be nothing left of your village. And so, yes, there's some anti-Semitism, but there's also a situation in which people just are afraid. And so saving somebody's life, which is the ethical thing to do, becomes for some of those people at that moment the non-ethical thing to do. Because you're saving other people's lives if you give that one up. And so this is the way these things happen. And most people are either abandoned who are in hiding are either abandoned to the Germans or are found because of this sort of situation. So you have and you have lots of cross currents. You have pre-existing anti-Semitism. In most of Eastern Europe, you have the fact that Jews are caught in the crossfire between nationalism and communism. And the Jews are generally associated in the minds of the nationalists with the communists. And so the nationalists say, these people are dangerous to us and to our cause, and so they tend to turn against the Jews. The communists are in retreat. They're not much help to the Jews, at least in this point in 1942. Again, the other thing to notice about these dates do matter in history. It's not just one, yeah? This is all before Stalingrad. The war, the Germans are winning the war until the very point there where, February of 43. The Germans are winning the war. So all of this is in the context of that. Now, once the war begins to turn against the Germans, then you can hope that the Russians are going to arrive. There'll be some reward for saving people and so on and so forth. People will appreciate what I did, maybe. But up until that moment, you've got also the weight of all these weights of practicality and issues, again, communism, nationalism, all these issues together, and they tend to dispose people not to save somebody. And they're watching this all. I mean, this is not a secret. These places, the Polish underground knows about these places almost as soon as they come into existence. Some they know virtually to the day. And they know people are dying in there. They're not quite sure how. You see these reports from the Polish underground that get to London. And we think people are going in there and they're being electrocuted. Or they speculate as to how the death is occurring. But they know people are dying in these places. And these names, they get known to people in Poles in London. They don't get known to the British intelligence, because there's a famous, January 43, right there, there's a famous tabulation that an SS man, Höfler, the man I told you about, who coordinated the trains, he does a tabulation, he sends a telegram to Berlin saying how many people have been killed at these sites, and he does it by initials. He does it, he includes A, Auschwitz, and he does Belchec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and one more, M, Majdanek, which was a camp at Lublin, sort of up here. It's historically been grouped as one of the death camps like this, but one of the things we've learned over the years is the number of Jews gassed at Majdanek was much smaller than we used to think. So I haven't included it in this discussion today. But so this telegram lists these places. There's an initial, A, M, B, and then a number beside it. And that's the number that Höfler says have been killed here. And this telegram is intercepted. It's delivered in Britain. The English have it, the British have it, and they don't know what it means. And so they don't pay attention. They don't know that the B is Bjushets. And so they don't pay attention to that tabulation. And that tabulation is probably a minimum number of people who died, because we're not sure whether it includes all the people who died in the trains on the way to those sites. And we're not sure how precisely the Germans counted anyway. But that number is always the base number when we try to estimate how many died at each of these camps. That telegram. But it meant nothing to people at the time. It means that to us now.
So the documentation that one hears about later on, where everyone's name is entered with the number, that was also subsequent to these actions?
What do you mean by everyone's name?
The tattooing of numbers of the...
Well, the tattooing occurred only at Auschwitz. People were not tattooed in any of these places because you were supposed to die here, and there was no reason to. And the tattooing at Auschwitz is a kind of afterthought in I believe it's 1941, might be early in 1942. The women prisoners are dying so fast that they can't keep a record of who has been in, they register people when they come into camp, but initially they didn't tattoo people. Then the women begin dying so fast that they realize they can't identify those bodies. They're getting to those bodies maybe 2 weeks after the person died, and they can't see who that was anymore, and so they tattoo as a way of identifying corpses. That's the way it starts. And so it doesn't occur at these other places. Yes?
This might be a matter of semantics, but would Operation Reinhard have happened had Heydrich not been killed? Would it have just been another operation?
I think so, because it was already in motion before he was killed. I mean, remember, they find the site of Chelmno in the middle of October. Actually, the commandant may have investigated about a week earlier. But both Chelmno and Buchetz are picked as places by October 13th, 1941. And of course, Heydrich is killed in 42.
Right.
So the name comes from Heydrich, but not the conception.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, and both of those start the same way. The idea is we're going to kill all the Jews in this reservoir of population. So we start with the one that's up here, because the Chelmno would be around here somewhere. And then they do this one, and then they do this one, and you can see they're picking new areas to eliminate people. Yes?
The logic of existence of police special forces is that is usually to ask for resources and to prove that they're very needed for the state. I'm interested if you have any evidence that all the commandants, all the people who work in the camps, do they try to advocate to give more sources? How they manage it? Do they just they can?
Well, it comes from the bottom, but not those commandants. It comes, for instance, up here where Chelmno starts, it's the Gauleiter of the region who is ambitious to eliminate Jews from his region. It's a Nazi aspiration. He wants the so-called Watergau, the annexed part of Poland, to be Judenrein. And so he puts pressure. And then it happens that the person who becomes the commandant at Chelmno is there and available, because his preceding job has been to kill the inmates of sanatoria and insane asylums in that neighboring part of Germany. So he's just easily transferable. But it's the Gauleiter who wants the action to take place. And then once he persuades, he gets authorization to basically kill the people in his region. Then he finds Lange, who is the man who becomes the head of this, because Lange has experience with those gas vans. And Lange is the one who drives into Chelmno and says, this building will do. So that's how it happens there. Now down here, it's a little bit more complicated around Buchetz, but it's basically a similar thing. The person who's putting the pressure for the activity is the local political leader. And then they find SS personnel. Now remember, all of the people, remember those 20 Germans at any one time, or 30? They're all experienced people. What had they done? They were working with the gas vans and the euthanasia institutions in Germany. There are 127 of them. In August of 1941, Hitler suspended the so-called euthanasia action, the killing of the people in the mental institution, the physically and mentally disabled. And he suspended it partly because of religious protests from the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, and decided from the point of view of domestic morale, we don't need to keep doing this. Besides, they had hit that month the target number of people they expected to kill, roughly 70,000. And so he stopped it. And the 127 people whose job had been to take the mental patients or the disabled into the gas chambers that were set up at these institutions, those people were transferred to the east. And some of them spend a little time in the fall of 1941 in lazaret and hospitals on the Eastern Front. But by December 41, they're all back at the prototype of this, and then available for the other ones. So all of these people who, the Germans, they become SS men, but they are already experienced with the murder of the mentally and physically handicapped.
Again, thank you for your presentation. Some very thoughtful history. I'm interested in your thoughts on beyond metaphor. So yes, metaphors are great, but about 78-90% of our population doesn't know what a metaphor is. So certainly it can't be the only explanation for why it continues, because historians have contributed to it.
Yeah.
Sure. Collective memory doesn't come from nowhere. Are we uncomfortable with an industrialized nation being barbaric? It's
ding, ding, ding.
more comfortable to be that.
Ding, ding, ding. No, I think, the word modernity was raised before. I think now, I'm just starting to try to put my thoughts together on this, is how this became the dominant metaphor and why it was so picked up. And it has to do with discomfort with modernity, I think. And particularly when you think of the 1950s, what kinds of books were dominant in sociology or in interpretation of social life? The Organization Man, the man in the gray flannel suit. There was this terrible fear of bureaucracy and the crushing power of the state or organizations, and people get caught in organizations. And this, of course, is manifest in Hannah Arendt. The banality of evil is built around this notion. But even in Raoul Hilberg's work, this sense that structures are what matter, bureaucracies, they have a life of their own once they get going, and so on. And I think that's true, and that was a moment of realization at mid-century. But we should also come back to some interpretive models that are a little earlier than that, Joseph Conrad. You know what I mean? The kind of interpretation that looks at human character and flaws and the way in which humans are corruptible and how that happens, because to blame it all on structures is a little bit of an excuse sometimes. And so I think we're rebalancing the scales a little bit, but I certainly think the reason why this metaphor became so dominant is this kind of fear of modernity. And and we all live in a world now that is much more complicated, simply from the point of view of population and mobilizing populations on the scale that we now are involved with. And human agency seems more difficult, I think, than it did in, you can never quite be sure about what things felt like in 1950, but even though I was there. But so that's what I think that's why the metaphor took.
Yeah, following up on that, and thank you so much for your talk, I was just remembering in one of the interviews in Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, where he's talking to Franz Zuckermel, who is an SS officer, Treblinka. Zuckermel himself describes Treblinka as a factory and an assembly line.
Yeah.
And so my thought here is that part of like the Auschwitz photo album, part of the Nazi rhetoric is being reproduced, perhaps unknowingly, in this metaphor.
Yeah, that may be the case. I think they liked the metaphor because it reduced human agency. I'm just a cog in the machine. And so that's why Zuckermel would say something like that. Well, I'm caught up in this giant machinery and, man konnte nicht umhin, you couldn't do anything to stop it. And I think that is why it's attractive to them. I think Eichmann loved this stuff because what he did is exaggerated how difficult his job was.
Yeah.
Eichmann actually, when the trial took place, he kept talking about his creativity, how he had to meet the challenge, as if loading 2,000 people into boxcars with no provision for food and water, and sending them on a railroad meandering across the European continent, as if that's a tough logistical challenge. Right? There's nothing to it, as long as you can get the cars. So they liked that because it dramatized what they did. But if you went back to, what you're doing is you're running a slaughterhouse. You're running, I'm from Chicago. You're running cattle through the stockyards. It's not grandiose, glorious work. And so I think that's part of what happened.
I think we have to take the last question.
Yes?
Yeah, really interesting. I was just curious, do we have a sense of, in terms of now, today, we operate, like immigrant detention camps and delinquency camps and black sites around the planet for, so have some of these designs filtered into kind of some of what we're doing now for our security?
Governments that are interested in controlling populations have, since the dawn of the 20th century, devised techniques of doing it. And one of them is you round up the people that you're concerned with, and you put them in a specific place and you hold them there. And basically concentration camps started in Cuba in the 1890s with the Spanish government trying to control rebels in the populations, in the provinces. It's a reflex that governments resort to when they are trying to keep certain groups separate from other groups. It's not particularly unique to the Nazis, and it may be. And there are offenses against civil rights and individual liberties that are common to these phenomena. But it doesn't take much knowledge of history to reach for that reflex. You know, it's not people reenacting the past when they do this. It's just the way governments behave when they see a challenge like this. Okay? Thank you all very much. In order? In order? Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you all for coming, and I think this reminded us, in a way, taking away from the kind of aspect of uniqueness, that this is kind of repeatable on a very low scale, and I think that shows really that we have to think also about the future in this case. Thank you very much.
Just been another operation?
I think so, because it was already in motion before he was killed. I mean, remember, they find the site of Chelmno in the middle of October. Actually, the commandant may have investigated about a week earlier, but both Chelmno and Buchetz are picked as places by October 13th, 1941, and of course Heydrich is killed in 42.
Right.
So the name comes from Heydrich, but not the conception.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, and both of those start the same way. The idea is we're going to kill all the Jews in this reservoir of population. So we start with the one that's up here, because the Chelmno would be around here somewhere. And then they do this one, and then they do this one, and you can see they're picking new areas to eliminate people. Yes?
The logic of existence of police special forces is that is usually to ask for resources and to prove that they're very needed for the state. I'm interested if you have any evidence that all the commandants, all the people who work in the camps, do they try to advocate to give more sources? How they manage it? So they just they can?
Well, it comes from the bottom, but not those commandants. It comes, for instance, up here where Chelmno starts, it's the Gauleiter of the region who is ambitious to eliminate Jews from his region. It's a Nazi aspiration. He wants the so-called Watergau, the annexed part of Poland, to be Judenrein. And so he puts pressure. And then it happens that the person who becomes the commandant at Chelmno is there and available, because his preceding job has been to kill the inmates of sanatoria and insane asylums in that neighboring part of Germany. So he's just easily transferable. But it's the Gauleiter who wants the action to take place. And then once he persuades, he gets authorization to basically kill the people in his region. Then he finds Lange, who is the man who becomes the head of this, because Lange has experience with those gas vans. And Lange is the one who drives into Chelmno and says, this building will do. So that's how it happens there. Now down here, it's a little bit more complicated around Buchetz, but it's basically a similar thing. The person who's putting the pressure for the activity is the local political leader. And then they find SS personnel. Now remember, all of the people, remember those 20 Germans at any one time, or 30? They're all experienced people. What had they done? They were working with the gas vans and the euthanasia institutions in Germany. There are 127 of them. In August of 1941, Hitler suspended the so-called euthanasia action, the killing of the people in the mental institution, the physically and mentally disabled. And he suspended it partly because of religious protests from the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, and decided from the point of view of domestic morale, we don't need to keep doing this. Besides, they had hit that month the target number of people they expected to kill, roughly 70,000. And so he stopped it. And the 127 people whose job had been to take the mental patients or the disabled into the gas chambers that were set up at these institutions, those people were transferred to the east. And some of them spend a little time in the fall of 1941 in lazaret and hospitals on the Eastern Front. But by December of 41, they're all back at the prototype of this, and then available for the other ones. So all of these people who, the Germans, they become SS men, but they are already experienced with the murder of the mentally and physically handicapped.
Again, thank you for your presentation, some very thoughtful history. I'm interested in your thoughts on beyond metaphor. So yes, metaphors are great, but about 78–90% of our population doesn't know what a metaphor is. So certainly it can't be the only explanation for why it continues, because historians have contributed to it.
Yeah. Sure.
Collective memory doesn't come from nowhere. Are we uncomfortable with an industrialized nation being barbaric? It's
ding, ding, ding.
more comfortable to be that.
Ding, ding, ding. No, I think, the word modernity was raised before. I think now, I'm just starting to try to put my thoughts together on this, is how this became the dominant metaphor and why it was so picked up. And it has to do with discomfort with modernity, I think. And particularly when you think of the 1950s, what kinds of books were dominant in sociology or in interpretation of social life? The Organization Man, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. There was this terrible fear of bureaucracy and the crushing power of the state or organizations, and people get caught in organizations. And this, of course, is manifest in Hannah Arendt. The banality of evil is built around this notion. But even in Raoul Hilberg's work, this sense that structures are what matter, bureaucracies, they have a life of their own once they get going, and so on. And I think that's true, and that was a moment of realization at mid-century. But we should also come back to some interpretive models that are a little earlier than that, Joseph Conrad. You know what I mean? The kind of interpretation that looks at human character and flaws and the way in which humans are corruptible and how that happens, because to blame it all on structures is a little bit of an excuse sometimes. And so I think we're rebalancing the scales a little bit, but I certainly think the reason why this metaphor became so dominant is this kind of fear of modernity. And and we all live in a world now that is much more complicated, simply from the point of view of population and mobilizing populations on the scale that we now are involved with. And human agency seems more difficult, I think, than it did in, you can never quite be sure about what things felt like in 1950, but even though I was there. But so that's what I think that's why the metaphor took.
Yeah, following up on that, and thank you so much for your talk, I was just remembering in one of the interviews in Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, where he's talking to Franz Suchamel, who is an SS officer, Treblinka. Suchamel himself describes Treblinka as a factory and an assembly line.
Yeah.
And so my thought here is that part of like the Auschwitz photo album, part of the Nazi rhetoric is being reproduced, perhaps unknowingly, in this metaphor.
Yeah, that may be the case. I think they liked the metaphor because it reduced human agency. I'm just a cog in the machine. And so that's why Suchamel would say something like that. Well, I'm caught up in this giant machinery, and man konnte nicht umhin, and you couldn't do anything to stop it. And I think that is why it's attractive to them. I think Eichmann loved this stuff because what it did is exaggerated how difficult his job was.
Yeah.
Eichmann actually, when the trial took place, he kept talking about his creativity, how he had to meet the challenge, as if loading 2,000 people into boxcars with no provision for food and water, and sending them on a railroad meandering across the European continent, as if that's a tough logistical challenge. Right? there's nothing to it, as long as you can get the cars. But so they liked that because it dramatized what they did. But if you went back to, what you're doing is you're running a slaughterhouse. You're running, I'm from Chicago. You're running cattle through the stockyards. It's not grandiose, glorious work. And so I think that's part of what happened.
I think we have to take the last question.
Yes?
Yeah, really interesting. I was just curious, do you have a sense, or do we have a sense of, in terms of like now, today, we operate, like immigrant detention camps and delinquency camps and black sites around the planet for, so have some of these designs filtered into kind of some of what we're doing now for our security?
Governments that are interested in controlling populations have, since the dawn of the 20th century, devised techniques of doing it. And one of them is you round up the people that you're concerned with and you put them in a specific place and you hold them there. And basically concentration camps started in Cuba in the 1890s with the Spanish government trying to control rebels in the populations, in the provinces. It's a reflex that governments resort to when they are trying to keep certain groups separate from other groups. It's not particularly unique to the Nazis, and it may be, and there are offenses against civil rights and individual liberties that are common to these phenomena. But it doesn't take much knowledge of history to reach for that reflex. It's not people reenacting the past when they do this. It's just the way governments behave when they see a challenge like this. Okay? Thank you all very much. In order? In order?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you all for coming, and I think this reminded us, in a way, taking away from the kind of aspect of uniqueness, that this is kind of repeatable on a very low scale, and I think that shows really that we have to think also about the future in this case. Thank you very much.